Hello and welcome to the Scuttlebutt Podcast. Today I'm speaking with a very distinguished guest, William Toti. William, or Bill, after a brief stint of enlisted time, attended the Naval Academy and graduated in 1979. He was nominated for the astronaut program, was in the Pentagon on 9/11, was the commanding officer of the USS Indianapolis submarine, and held several executive positions at defense companies after his time in. Perhaps one of the most notable of the achievements is his contribution to World War II history. The original USS Indianapolis, a Portland-class heavy cruiser, was one of the most famous ships throughout our war in the Pacific. The Indy participated in at least 10 distinct battles during World War II, carried the atomic bomb Titanium, which later ended the war, and shortly thereafter was sunk after being torpedoed by a Japanese submarine. Bill shares the full story here today, but the captain of the Indy at that time, Charles McVay, was court-martialed for, quote, hazarding his ship. Fast forward to the year 2000, Charles McVay was exonerated for the sinking of the ship, due in large part to Bill's analysis of the ship and torpedoes at that time proved no action McVay took could have spared the ship. It's an absolutely incredible story, and Bill's contribution to this historical event is difficult to measure. The impact on the survivors' lives is even more notable. There are multiple documentaries available to watch on this story, and I'd highly recommend watching them. In preparation for this conversation, I watched the USS Indianapolis, The Legacy, a 2015 documentary, which is available for free online. It does a great job of encapsulating this historic event that you've probably never heard. We go on after our conversation about the Indy to talk about Bill's time in industry. After spending time in the corporate world, Bill noticed and felt a large gap in the understanding veterans have of what it takes to be successful after the service. He authored the book From CO to CEO, a practical guide for transitioning from military to industry leadership. He has some great thoughts on having better understanding of expectations as veterans and how to help control your own personal narrative. I'm so grateful for Bill coming on and sharing his knowledge. If you're a student of military history or even history in general, there's a lot of lessons to take from this conversation. Please enjoy this conversation with Bill Toti. Bill, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. I was telling you just before we started recording here how much I've been looking forward to this conversation. Mr. Toti, I feel like that's how I should be addressing you. Your life and career has like an unbelievably long list of accomplishments. You graduated the Naval Academy in 1979. If I have my notes right here, you were nominated for an astronaut mission. Is that?
Well, for the astronaut program, yeah, that was my life's ambition, and I was nominated by the Navy and failed the eye exam, and so they kicked me out.
God had other plans. He said,
yeah,
we're
exactly.
going to tweak that eyesight just a little bit. Mm-hmm. You've held several executive positions at large defense contractors. I can't even get through the list here. There's so many. One of the more notable achievements, and I think that you would agree to this as well, is you assisted in the exoneration of Charles McVay in the US Indianapolis sinking. All of those combined, how would you sum up your life and career up until now?
I've had more excitement than I probably deserve or, would have wanted in many ways. I would say that. There was no plan, right? I think that I went to the Naval Academy because I wanted to be an astronaut. And back in those days, you had to be a pilot to be an astronaut in the 70s. When I finally did get nominated, it was after they created the mission specialist aspect of the astronaut program for space shuttle. And, so I was going to be a backseater in the space shuttle. That was the plan anyway, and didn't quite do that. So I ended up staying in submarines for my entire Navy career, 26 years, commanded USS Indianapolis. It's a Los Angeles class fast attack submarine, and then was Commodore Submarine Squadron 3. And on the Navy side, I just kept I wish I could tell you that I had a plan. I was going to stay in for this number of years and then transition out. And towards the end, I started generating a plan. But over the course of my 26-year Navy career, it was just like, okay, I'll do one more tour. Well, I'll do one more tour. It was one of those things where you say, well, I'll keep doing it until I stop having fun and stop enjoying the jobs. I'll say it that way. I don't want to make it sound like it was a joyride the entire time, because you were in the Navy, it's not always a joyride. So
it's absolutely true.
Yeah. So I did that. I stayed in until I said, wait a minute, if I don't transition fairly soon, I'm going to be too old to have a meaningful second career in industry. I was in my mid 40s at that point. And so I made the decision to jump to industry when I did, so that I could have a viable second career. And 15 years in industry, culminating in a CEO position. So it's been a great career. Had a lot of exciting times and one very bad day on 9/11. But I don't know how to summarize the career, because I don't want to pretend that there was a grand strategic plan. There was not.
I think that that's the right way to put it. So many discussions around people's life and career in the military is often pitched as a binary decision of, oh, are you
Right.
going to do 20? Are you going to make it a career? Rather than a constant evaluation of, am I still having a good time? Do I have a better option? Like, are
Mhm.
there higher demands of my personal and professional time? Is that the advice that you would give to somebody that's maybe considering, we'll probably get into some transition
Yeah,
stuff later, but is that kind of some on the surface level advice you would give
it
to
is.
somebody that's
Honestly, I never planned to make the Navy a career. In fact, when you graduate from the academy, you got to put in 5 years on active duty to pay back the Navy for the education you got at the academy. And our motto, graduated in 1979, right? Our motto was out the door in 84, right? And so I planned to get out of the Navy in 1984. In fact, I applied to medical school, was accepted, and was on my way out the door in 84 when this astronaut thing opened up again for me. And because the mission specialist program began. So I thought, well, I'll go to graduate school for mission specialist for astronautics, for space program. And after I get a master's degree in that, then I'll apply. And that's what I did. So I stayed in the Navy for graduate school, then applied for the Navy, for the astronaut program, was nominated and failed out. So I ended up, having to pay back for the graduate program at that point, because, they gave me a master's degree. And that brought me past, I'd say, the 10-year point. And then I got a really interesting job where I was ordered to the Pentagon working for General Colin Powell on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Joint Staff. And that was the first job I had in the military where I said, holy cow, this is really intriguing. It was during Desert Storm, if you remember that. And I was in the National Military Command Center standing watch as we were going to war. And, from an intellectual stimulating standpoint of planning a campaign, a combat campaign in Iraq, I was, I don't want to say enjoying it from the fun standpoint, but it was extremely stimulating intellectually. And that's when I said, well, maybe this can be rewarding in a way that I had not anticipated. And that caused me to stay in. And once you get past 13, 14 years and you keep screening, right? So I screened for XO, and then I screened for command, and then I screened for Commodore, for Major Command, right? Those little carrots that they dangle in front of you keep you in for the next tour and the next tour. And pretty soon it's 26 years and you say, holy cow, that went fast. And that's the way it went for me.
they say time flies when you're having fun. It
Right.
sounds like that must have been true for you. What was, I'm not sure what the right word is here, but what it was the feeling in the atmosphere like in the Pentagon at that time? You called it intellectually stimulating.
Mhm.
Can you kind of unpack that a little bit? What does that mean? It just challenging or thinking like large scale? Because that's, I mean, you went to school for physics, if I'm not
Yeah, my
mistaken here.
undergrad. Yeah. Yeah, well, it had nothing to do with the physics education. But right before I reported the Joint Staff, I went to what was then called the Armed Forces Staff College. now called the Joint Forces Staff College, where I learned operational campaign planning, how to build time phase force deployment directives and things like that. So you learned operational art, and you study war college classes on like how Gettysburg campaign evolved. So you learn how to do battle planning, and then you find yourself thrust in the middle of what turned out to be a very short ground war, just a few days really. And but you're in the middle of that, where you're talking about developing options for how we might fight the war. And I was in the room. I was a fly on the wall. I was like nobody, but I was in the room to witness a couple of grand arguments between two guys who are no longer alive now, General Schwarzkopf and General Powell, regarding whether we are going to continue to go up to Baghdad or not. And it was kind of, you realize that you're here in the middle of this storm in an incredible moment of history, and you've got a front row seat to history. And that is not something I could have done or would have done, or anybody could do really in industry, right? So you realize that being in the military during times like that give you a unique perspective on how history is evolving. And that was fascinating to me.
How did those conversations develop, and how did your feelings and kind of understanding about the war during that time? And then can you maybe talk about how you maybe feel now, kind of within the last year, we pulled out of Afghanistan and kind of been fighting this 20-year war. Were we discussing the same things back then?
So yeah, in many ways, I would say that in the Gulf War, because I was obviously also on active duty post 9/11. In the Gulf War, General Powell was very disciplined in defining exit strategy, right? We're going to war, but we're not going to find ourselves in the same kind of quagmire we found ourselves in Vietnam. So we're going to articulate specific objectives. And when we meet those objectives, we declare victory and we're done and we leave. And so in Vietnam, of course, the objectives kept changing. And so we were there 7 years, seemed like a long time at the time. But as you said, Afghanistan, 20 years, the objectives kept changing. So it was in many ways heartbreaking to me that we didn't exercise more discipline in why we were in Afghanistan and what it would mean, what the criteria would be for us to leave. Now, some people openly argued that, well, we're still in Germany and Japan, right? And so maybe we need to be in Afghanistan for the next 50 years. And so there was a contingent that would make those arguments, but not really say why that's true. We're in Germany to stabilize the Russian threat, and we have been throughout the Cold War. And people don't want to say this, but we were in Japan, at least for the first 50 years, to kind of calm China because of what Japan did to China during World War II. And by having, China didn't see us in those days as a threat. And so by having us in Japan, we kind of guaranteed China that Japan will not ever emerge as a renewed threat to China. It's no longer true in 2022, of course, where China does see us as a threat. That's another matter. But nobody could say in Afghanistan why that needed to be the case. And so it did become a quagmire rather than just saying, okay, we're done, pulling out, which is what we did in Vietnam, by the way, in 1975. We just left, right? We didn't articulate why we were leaving other than we're tired, we're going home. We're picking up our toys and going home. We did the same thing in Afghanistan in a very unceremonious way that I think people who criticize the way we left are right to criticize it. But it all started with the failure to define strategic objectives that we were trying to accomplish in Afghanistan. And because we never defined those objectives, we could never say that we met them. So 20 years go by and you say, what are we still doing here? Nobody could really answer the question.
You talked about your time learning operational strategy and sitting in on some of those really high value, high impact conversations in the Pentagon during that time. What did you take from there that you maybe influenced your leadership style when you went on to be the CO of the USS Indianapolis?
Well, I was CEO of Indianapolis, obviously before 9/11. One of the things I learned early on, studying, deck plate leaders the way I did. I was a student of history, World War II, still am, and studied very successful leaders, even guys like Colin Powell that I worked for as a lieutenant commander. Right, was that these were successful leaders are people that aren't afraid to get their hands dirty, to jump in the middle of it. I'll go back to, and again, I'm not sure I told you this, but I was enlisted before I went to the academy. Again, I wanted to be an astronaut in high school, and I'd applied for the Air Force Academy, got appointed, and then had the opportunity to meet John Glenn when he was campaigning for senator in Ohio. I was growing up in a town outside of Youngstown, Ohio. And when, I joined his campaign, I was 16. It's too young to vote. But what I really did was put signs in yards, vote for Glenn kind of signs. And so I got to meet him once, and he, not realizing how young and naive I was when I met him, I said, "Hey, Mr. Glenn, I want to be an astronaut just like you. And I've applied for the Air Force Academy." Well, he teased me about that, right? He said, "What the heck? Don't you know anything about me? I was a Marine. Why are you going to the Air Force Academy? The best pilots are in the Marine Corps and the Navy, and landing on carriers and things like that." And I said, "Oh, well, I didn't." And I'm thinking this, I didn't say to him, "But I didn't apply to the Naval Academy. So what am I going to do now?" And so I had a year to kill out of high school because I couldn't apply until the next year. And so I said, "Well, to improve my chances of getting the Naval Academy, I'll prove to them how serious I am. I'll enlist." So I enlisted in the Navy as out of high school as a Navy nuke submariner, right? An electronic technician. And, naively believed that, okay, all I have to do is apply to the Naval Academy, not realizing how improbable it would be to get two appointments to two different academies in 2 consecutive years. I stupidly naively enlisted for 6 years. And then, I was going to ETA school. Senior chief who ran ETA school. I kept telling him, "Well, I'm not going to be here long because I'm going to the Naval Academy next year." And he would laugh at me. And when I did get accepted, he wasn't laughing anymore. And it was like, and of course, I'm too young and naive and stupid to realize how lucky I was that my plan actually worked. But he said, I'm going to have you, you're never going to forget what it's like to be an enlisted man. So you leave the academy in 3 months. I'm pulling you out of ETA school. I'm not going to waste a seat on you since you're never going to be an ET in the fleet, electronics technician in the fleet. And for the next 3 months, you're in charge of cleaning heads. So for 3 months, I cleaned toilets. And, and he says, I never want you to forget what it's like when somebody has absolute control over your life, like you may have someday as an officer. And so that's what I did for 3 months. I cleaned toilets, and I never forgot that lesson. I still remember his name, Senior Chief New City. It's like, there's certain lessons in life you never forget, but that one stuck with me. And so as a young officer, I was never afraid to jump in. And, if my auxiliary men were repairing a hydraulic accumulator, I was down there with them, helping to repair the hydraulic accumulator, and so on and so forth. And I tried to be that kind of leader throughout my Navy career. I worked for some really bad leaders, by the way, during my Navy career. And again, I learned as many lessons from the bad leaders as I did from the good ones. And I tried to assimilate those. So I would say my leadership style evolved over the course of my Navy career and probably continues to evolve today.
I think that that's what they really mean by that whole concept of deck plate leadership. That will probably when you first said that, it kind of sent shivers up my spine, not in the good way, because everybody, enlisted folks on
Hmm.
ships or whatever are kind of sick of hearing that because it's, something that's preached, but not something that's seen.
Hmm.
And it's interesting that you would jump in there and do that because I think that that's what should be done. You're leading people and you lead by example. You may not be in there with your elbows up to in grease every day, but being willing to do that kind of stuff is so inspiring for a junior enlisted person. And that plays out if you look at, maybe it's just the scuttlebutt,
Hmm.
but scuttlebutt of people on the boats talking about former enlisted officers.
Hmm.
There's a respect there that is given that I think non prior enlisted officers just don't have and might never get, to be honest.
Yeah, and I can't claim that I have a great deal of enlisted experience. I wasn't in the fleet. I didn't, suffer mightily at the hands
Three
of
months
some.
of cleaning heads is pretty bad.
Yeah, yeah. I
I'll
was
give you
enlisted
that.
for I think just under a year from, so before I started at the academy. But it was, yeah, senior chief, new cities lessons stuck with me.
That's fantastic. I want to transition into your time as the CEO of the USS Indianapolis.
Hmm.
Um, Leading up to this conversation, I've done quite a bit of research, reading and watching films and documentaries about the famous USS Indianapolis sinking in 1945, beginning of the year, I believe. I want to hear the story from you, though. And I'd love if
Sure.
you would kind of give our listeners a breakdown and run through of what actually happened. You've done extensive research on the matter. And like I said, ended up leading to the exoneration of the captain that was court-martialed for the sinking. I would love to hear the story from your perspective and your learnings, how you got tied into it, and where we stand today.
When It started when I was a plebe at the academy. So when you're a plebe at the academy, you do these things called chow calls, sorry. And so chow call is something that plebes have to do, stand up and scream out at the top of their lungs various bits of trivia before you go to meals, right? And to inform the upperclassmen of, various nonsense. It's just really, it's a memorization drill is what it ends up being. But one of the easy things about chow calls during my plebe year, one of the things we used to have to yell out was what movies were playing in town. And so this is before the multiplex was invented. And so there were 2 or 3 theaters in town. You only had to memorize 2 or 3 movies. Now there'd be 18, right? So they don't do it anymore. That bit they don't do anymore. But for my entire plebe summer, this movie was playing in town called Jaws. So it was easy to remember because it never changed. At the Playhouse, at the Circle Theater was Jaws, right? So it was easy to remember for the child. At the end of plebe summer, when you're allowed out for your first liberty, of course, you've been yelling out about this movie Jaws for the entire plebe summer. And so you say, I want to see this movie. And in the movie Jaws, there's this character named Quint who gives this monologue towards the end of the movie where he talks about the USS Indianapolis and how it sunk and how he spent days in the water fighting sharks and all of that. And so it was a great movie, enjoyed it. And at plebe year, you have this class called the History of Sea Power. And my professor was a man by the name of E.B. Potter, who wrote the textbook, The History of Sea Power, that we were using with Admiral Nimitz. Incredible, right? And so if anybody would know, he would know. So the Monday morning after we saw this movie, Jaws, out in the theater, go to the History of Sea Power class and say, hey, Professor Potter, in the movie Jaws, they talked about this World War II cruiser Indianapolis. Is that a true story? And he said, well, it's World War II. We're going to cover that second semester. We're doing the Peloponnesian War or whatever it was now. We'll talk about that later. No. We want to know, is that a true story? Yes, it's a true story. That's all he would give us, right? And until second semester. So I learned about the Indianapolis from that movie first. But then later, when I was commissioned and I reported to Pearl Harbor to report to my first boat, USS Omaha, USS Indianapolis submarine had been commissioned. and was going on its first deployment. And it was intriguing to me that I could serve on the submarine USS Indianapolis. So I asked the cross deck from the Omaha, even though I'd just come back from deployment on the Omaha. And even though I was a newlywed, I was just married, I asked the cross deck on the Indianapolis because they need experienced watch officers. And so my detail will let me do it. So I reported to the Indianapolis first as a junior officer, spent almost 2 years on Indy as a junior officer. Then I was ordered back after serving as chief engineer on USS Buffalo. I was ordered back to be navigator operations officer on Indianapolis. And then I was ordered back a third time after I was XO on USS Florida to be CO of USS Indianapolis. So I served 3 times on that ship, the Indianapolis. And I don't know of anybody else who's ever done that before. And it's a great ship. But by the time I was ordered on board as the captain, I knew that ship inside out, right? And so nobody could fool me on what,
You knew all the hiding spots and everything.
I did, yeah. My signatures from my time as damage control assistant, as a junior officer, as navigator, were all over that ship, right? And so, over decades worth of experience, probably 15 years on that ship. So at the end of my command tour, the Navy decides they're going to decommission my submarine 15 years, 18 years into its life, halfway through its life, right? As Cold War had ended, peace was breaking out over the world. We would never need submarines again. I mean, that was kind of the philosophy during the Clinton years. Funny how that didn't work out. We're not really good at predicting the future and, what we wouldn't give now to have all those submarines back. But anyway, we were going to save a little bit of money, and it's going to end up costing us a lot more money to replace the submarines that we could have kept. But that's another story. So we are going about to decommission the submarine. On our last deployment, we did a wreath laying at the site of the sinking of the cruiser. And I started a kind of a pen pal communication scheme with the World War II cruiser survivors. Because, at the time there were, something around 150 of them still alive out of the 316 that survived the sinking. And so I would write reports to the survivors of the cruiser periodically. We were going on our last deployment. The ship hadn't lit the world on fire during my prior tours on board. We never won a unit commendation. We never won the Battle E. We never won, in its entirety, 16 years of existence when I took command. And the good news was we did set the world on fire during my command. It was great crew. We did some incredible, highly classified missions that earned us a Navy unit commendation and the Battle E and the 7th Fleet Award for Best Submarine and all kinds of things like that, right? So we went out in style. But I wrote to the survivors and said, look, you guys never got to decommission your ship because it was sunk. And so I'm told we're going to have to decommission the submarine. I'd like you to come and take part in the decommissioning ceremony. So I asked them to, we couldn't pay for it, but I asked them to come to Hawaii, and at one point it would stand with my crew during the decommissioning ceremony. And these guys were, the youngest of them were in their 70s at this point in time, right? So you can imagine a bunch of 70-something-year-olds standing with my crew of 21 average age, right? But almost 30 of them did it. They showed up. And so it was wonderful. And they got to help me decommission my ship. And we kind of combined the crews for the decommissioning ceremony of the cruiser and the submarine. And, it was one of those poignant moments where you realize, this is really important, what we're doing right now. And it's a good thing that we're doing. So it was at the ceremony, at the reception following this decommissioning ceremony, 2 of the survivors came up to me, a guy by the name of Paul Murphy and a guy by the name of Glenn Morgan. And they poked me in the chest, right? Of course, I'm in my dress whites, right? And they said, Bill, we've been trying to get our captain exonerated since 1960, since our very first reunion, because he was court-martialed. And we could talk about the life of the cruiser next. But their point was, We have not been successful to date, but you're a captain of a submarine. We were sunk by a submarine. Maybe you can contribute something, or we think you owe it. I was the 10th and final commanding officer of the submarine. Their captain, McVay, was the 10th and final commanding officer of the cruiser. We think you owe it to Captain McVay to help clear his name. So that's how they kind of hoodwinked me. The old word would be shanghaied me, drafted me into their exoneration plan. And maybe we should talk a moment about the cruiser.
Yeah, I do want to hear kind of the story of the cruiser from your perspective, but what a lot of strange, seemingly coincidences about like the numbers, and what a cool opportunity to honor former sailors for probably what was likely a very emotional event for them.
It was, yeah. It was poignant in a bunch of ways. But let me tell you a funny story as well, because I owe it to posterity to let this story be known. So we're in the reception following the decommissioning ceremony, and the senior enlisted person on a submarine is called the chief of the boat, or Cobb for short. And so my Cobb comes up to me and pulls me aside. Captain, we've got a problem. And you think, 70-some-year-old, somebody passed out from heat. It wasn't that hot in Hawaii that day, but this was in February. And, I can only imagine bad things. And I said, okay, well, what's going on, Cobb? And he said, they're stealing the plates. And I said, what? They're stealing the plates. Who? The survivors. What are you talking about? They're down in the cruise mess and they're stealing the plates. And I said, oh God, you got to be kidding me. Okay, I'll take care of this. And so, I had them take tours. I allowed them to take tours of the submarine after. They can't go to the engine room, but anywhere else. And I had my crew members taking them around the ship. And apparently they connived, to steal the plates. All of our plates had USS Indianapolis 697 on them.
We're talking like dinnerware, right? Like
exactly, yeah,
that you eat off of, not
exactly.
like any type of metal plates
no,
from
no.
the ship or anything, like
exactly.
Actual dinner plates.
So I climb down into the ship. Again, I'm in full whites, right? Full dress whites. And, I think I took my sword off before I climbed back down. But anyway, and so I go down there and they're there on the cruise mess and with this, sly grin on their face. And guys, what the heck are you doing here? I heard you can't steal my plates. And one of the guys, again, Glenn Morgan, the one who buttonholed me and told me that I needed help, McVay, he's got this written, why, Bill? I don't know what you're talking about. And of course, inside his shirt, I see the round outline of a plate that he'd stuffed down in his shirt, right? So here's these 70-something-year-old thieves that have been let loose on my submarine and, taking anything that they could take without, getting put in jail for it. And so I let them, and they took them all. And so back in 2005, jump forward, that would be 7 years later, I had started going to their reunions every year, starting in 1999. And in 2005, they declared that I would be named an honorary survivor. And at the ceremony, at the reunion, survivors reunion, they presented me with a plate. That was the first time they admitted that they actually stole them. So I didn't confront them in 1998, and I just let them get away with it. And they made light of it by presenting me with. It's the only way I have a plate from my ship, is that I was given one by a survivor who stole it. But these were the kind of guys they were. They went through decades of misery. Many of them became alcoholics after they were sunk. And again, we got to go back and tell the story to understand why. But once they started having their reunions in 1960, that began the process of healing. And it's a really important lesson for people suffering from PTSD today, PTS today. It really took them getting together on a regular basis and sharing stories and sharing the pain that they had been going through in the decades following the sinking, for them to start healing. And by the time I met them in 98, many of them were fully recovered and, back to their old devious sailor ways that you may know something about.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's some really interesting commentary on the healing process, and especially coming from a generation of people who, stuffed their problems.
They were
Really,
stoic.
it's they
Right.
very stoic, put all the problems down, and I think that we see remnants of that throughout a lot of senior military, how we handle stuff today, even.
Yep. That's true.
Um, and they really highlighted that. I had mentioned this at the beginning, but as part of my research process, I had watched the USS Indianapolis, the Legacy 2015 documentary, and they, in the interviews, talked a lot about how getting back together with their crew, the other survivors, was pivotal in the healing process for them,
Mhm.
because this was such a catastrophic event
It
of
was,
on
yeah.
so many magnitudes. I would love, people can go and read all about the story all over the place, but I would love to hear your version from your study and working with them, your version of what happened to the cruiser, the USS Indianapolis.
The interesting thing about the story is that we continue to learn things even this late, right? So the best book is the one that came out the latest, right? It's always true. And that is the 1990, I'm sorry, 2018, I think, or 2019 book titled Indianapolis, the worst sea disaster in naval history and the 50-year fight to exonerate an innocent man. Written by Sarah Vladic, Vladic, and Lynn Vincent. And the reason that's the best is because they discovered things in the National Archives over the course of their research while they were writing that book that I don't think anybody had put together before. And I helped them interpret what they discovered, but I didn't do any of the discovery myself. The cruiser was, the keel was, it was commissioned in 1932. It was what was called a treaty cruiser. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1920 limited the size of naval combatants among the signatory countries. So, because none of the countries involved wanted to get into another arms race and have to build, the Great White Fleet again and spend a whole bunch of national capital. So, what they said was ships greater than 10,000 tons in displacement, there would be a limit on the number of ships you could build greater than 10,000 tons displacement. So Indianapolis was one of those that was under 10,000 tons. And in order to keep it under 10,000 tons, it had limited armor. And we're talking, when I say armor, it's armor plating on the sides of the ship to protect against, gun rounds and torpedoes. And that limited armor would become pivotal in its future because, it didn't anticipate World War II when they signed the Washington Naval Arms Treaty of 1920. So commissioned in 1932, for a period of time, President Roosevelt, we're talking about Franklin Roosevelt, used it as a ship of state to travel anywhere he wanted to go. If internationally, he would travel on the Indianapolis. So it was a pretty important ship. During World War II, it became Admiral Raymond Spruance's flagship for the Fifth Fleet. And so even in World War II, it was pivotal. It was present at 10 major battles during the war. Tarawa, Peleliu, it just pretty much anything you could think of. Anytime the Spruance and the Fifth Fleet was present, Indianapolis was there. When Halsey and the Third Fleet was running the show, Indianapolis was back in Pearl Harbor planning for the next battle, whatever it was. So it was pivotal in a bunch of different battles during the war. During the day before the landing began on the Battle of Okinawa, for example, it was struck by a kamikaze. 9 sailors died. I think it was 17 that were wounded. It had significant flooding in the engine room. It could only run on one of two of the 4 engines. It only took heroic action from the crew to keep it from sinking. So they, you know, fought hard to keep that ship from being a complete loss, but it had to go back to Mare Island to be repaired. So it traveled all the way across the Pacific with, I think, a 15-degree list, which is pretty substantial if you've been on a ship with a list like that. And so they happened to be in Mare Island at the end of the repair period when the Hiroshima atomic bomb needed to be transported to Tinian. And they were essentially a vessel of opportunity to transport the Hiroshima bomb. So the Hiroshima bomb was put on them. They were told steam across the Pacific. They weren't told what this big package was that they had on board, but they were told that the faster you get across the Pacific, the quicker the war ends. So they streamed across the Pacific at flank speed and, stopping only in Pearl Harbor to refuel, and got to Tinian, delivered their package, didn't know what it was. When they were in Mare Island during that repair period, a third of the crew turned over. New sailors got on board. These sailors had never been to sea before. So they're getting underway on this flank speed run across the Pacific with a third of their crew untrained. And so Captain McVay, Charles Butler McVay, who was the commanding officer, knew he needed to get this crew trained. And so his objective was to get to Leyte as quickly as possible after they dropped their package off at Tinian, because there's a training squadron in Leyte. There were target aircraft, target ships, things like that. And they could practice. He did what he could as he was running across the Pacific, but you can't do a lot of training when you're running at flank speed, right? So, his objective was, it was routed from Guam to Leyte. And on the 30th of July, just after midnight, a Japanese submarine I-58 saw him, fired a spread of 6 torpedoes, hit him with 2 torpedoes, and sunk the ship. And, when they went in the water with about 879 sailors surviving the sinking, so over 300 sailors were killed by the torpedoes, by the fires, or went down with the ship. In the water, when they were finally rescued, they said, "Who did you see in the water? Name people that you recognize, or number of people in your group, and things like that." So they're able to do a tally to determine that 879 men got into the water. And so, but after, they were not reported missing through a bunch of screw ups on the Navy's part. And so they were left to float out there in the water for just over 4 days and nights. On the 5th day, they were finally rescued. And so they spent 5 days in the water. And they were discovered through an incredible stroke of luck. A Ventura airplane, an anti-submarine airplane, just happened to be flying over and just happened to be in the right place, and just happened to have a problem with its trailing wire high-frequency antenna that caused the pilot of the airplane to have to go back aft and look down to fix the the trailing wire antenna. Looking down at the water, he saw an oil slick, thought it might be a submarine, ran up to the cockpit, dived the airplane to look for that submarine that he thought might be down there, and sees heads bobbing in the water. It was serendipity. It was no plan, just amazing coincidence. And then, of course, he radios in that there's people in the water. And imagine, this is halfway between 600 miles between the Marianas and Leyte. So this is 300 miles from land. And he just happens to be in the right spot at the right time to see these guys. Otherwise, none of them would survive. And so,
Well, and 300 miles is probably doesn't sound like a lot when you're thinking about a driving distance, but when you're out in the middle of the ocean and you can see whatever the horizon is, I want to say, is it 19 miles is something that you can see on a perfectly clear day, that's the horizon. There's an unbelievably large distance between anything.
Yeah. So so he radios in, a PBY shows up, lands on the water. By the way, that's not the first time that happened. That also happened when the USS Juno was sunk. But a whole bunch of ships show up, including, one of the first ones was the USS Cecil Doyle. Captain of that ship was a Lieutenant Commander Graham Claytor, who later became Secretary of the Navy and signed my commission, as it turns out, right? And so, they rescued 316 survivors. By the way, for years, the survivors kept saying the correct number was 317. And so you'll hear, even I made the mistake of believing the survivors on that number. Turns out one guy got off the ship in Pearl Harbor, and he, the luckiest crew member in USS Indianapolis history. And so he wasn't on board when the ship sank, but the ship's manifest was never updated when he got off the ship in Pearl Harbor. And it was only because he was still alive 2-3 years afterwards and wasn't part of the crew when it sank that they were able to reconstruct. Just a couple of years ago, put to bed the 317 number. The correct number is 316, not 317. So for decades, I would say that the survivors claimed that it was 317 and they were wrong. But anyway, after they were recovered, the Navy decided to court-martial the captain, Charles McVay, because he wasn't zigzagging at the moment the torpedo struck him. And he was convicted for hazarding his vessel by not zigzagging in 1945, December 1945. So they sunk in July 1945. They were rescued on August 3rd, 1945, and he was court-martialed in December. And that stuck in the craw of the survivors for decades, right? They always felt like the Navy was blaming them for being sunk. And the Navy kept saying, oh, no, we're not blaming you. We know this is an act of war. We're not blaming you. We're only blaming the captain because he wasn't zigzagging. And so when they recruited me into the effort to exonerate McVay, 1998, so they've been trying since 1960. By the way, McVay committed suicide in 1968. Okay. So in 1998, they recruit me into their exoneration plot. The only thing I could do that had not been done before, is people had been making arguments for decades that it was his right to decide to not zigzag, which is true, right? But any captain can get, just because it's your right to do something, if something bad happens when you're doing it, any captain's going to be held accountable for that bad thing, right? So the fact that it was his prerogative to zigzag or not doesn't protect him from punishment for an outcome when he's not zigzagging, right? So that was the bit of of naval, law that the survivors failed to understand. They kept saying he had the right to zigzag at his discretion. It doesn't matter. That's the problem.
Can we talk about, or sorry to interrupt you, but
sure.
Can you explain, I'm assuming that zigzagging is like kind of a defensive maneuver while operating a ship. What does that mean? Why was that the right thing to do in this circumstance? What was the problem, and like how did that evolve with how he chose to maneuver the ship?
Yeah, as a submariner, right, as a submarine captain, I can tell you that zigzagging is a defense of desperation. It's something you do when you can't do the things that work. Okay, so zigzagging is completely ineffective. So the reason people invented the tactic is if in the old days when submarines would fire 1 or 2 torpedoes, you don't fire it's just like when you're playing hockey. When you're trying to go after the puck, you don't skate to where the puck is. You skate to where the puck will be, right? And so you have to kind of anticipate where the puck will be and you skate to that point. If you're firing 1 or 2 torpedoes, you don't fire the torpedo at where the ship is. You fire it at where the ship will be. Now, if the ship maneuvers after you fired it, then it's going to be in a different spot than the spot you thought it would be when you fired the torpedo. And you're going to miss, okay? So far, so good. The problem is, so surface ships were instructed when they believed there was a threat of a submarine to zigzag in order to mess up the fire control calculation that the submarine had done before they fired the torpedo. The problem with that is every ship in the planet started zigzagging, right? And so submariners aren't stupid. You don't keep doing what you were doing when it's ineffective. You modify the tactic. And so in World War II, the tactics were modified by both us and the Japanese so that we wouldn't fire just one torpedo. We would fire a spread of 6 torpedoes. And that spread of torpedoes postulates every conceivable zig the target ship can make and anticipates the zig so that at least one of those 6 torpedoes will hit it. So nearly every ship that was, and we struck millions of tons of shipping during World War II, we Americans, right? And the Japanese sunk many of our ships as well. And nearly every one of those ships that was sunk was zigzagging. So the point is that the zigzagging tactic doesn't work most of the time when the attacking ship fires a spread of torpedoes. Now, you were going to ask a question. I'll let you ask.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, there was something that they mentioned in the documentary that the circumstances of this attack may have been made worse by the fact that they were not in anticipation of a submarine attack. They had mentioned that they were supposed to be escorted by, they had no capabilities on this specific ship of underwater radar at the time. At least that's what they said. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah,
only airborne. I guess how would they have known that they were in the threat of an attack? And then could you kind of describe for us non-submarine folks here? I'm an aviation guy, so how is there an estimation about how far they were when they fired these 6 torpedoes, and how long is it expected that, are they half a mile away and it takes 2 minutes to get there, or what is the time of impact from launch for a circumstance like this?
Yeah, so just rough numbers, I'm rounding these now, right? The ship, the submarine was around 1,200 yards, so it's just over half a nautical mile in range when they fired the salvo. And just think about these torpedoes run at 50 miles an hour. So you can kind of, they're pretty fast, right? And so,
and that submarine, half a nautical mile, that's right on top of them.
Yeah, like basically. But in those days, these were dumb torpedoes. They weren't acoustic homing torpedoes. So you had to be pretty close to improve your chance of getting a hit. By the way, the best defense against torpedoes like that is actually speed. If you can run fast, the torpedo is likely to run out of fuel, because at 50 miles an hour, the torpedo consumes fuel at a very high rate. The torpedo is likely to run out of fuel before it catches you. So going fast is a better defense than zigzag. And it's interesting, they didn't prosecute McVay for not going fast. They prosecuted him for not zigzagging, and going fast would have been a better defense. But anyway, and just to close that zigzag issue out, the only contribution I was able to make as a submariner was I was able to model the attack in my torpedo computer on my submarine. And even though we had modern torpedoes, you can actually turn the acoustics off of the modern torpedoes and make them run like old dumb World War II torpedoes. And so my computer could be programmed to simulate acoustic mode off, it's called, straight running dumb torpedoes with a salvo. So what I was able to do that of course they couldn't do in 1945 because they didn't have computers. They couldn't do this in McVay's defense in 1945, which would allow him to have been exonerated in 1945. What I was able to do in 1998, 1999 was prove that even if he had been zigzagging, he would have been struck by at least one torpedo. So he didn't hazard his vessel by not zigzagging. Therefore, he was indeed innocent. Okay, so that was the one bit of contribution I was able to make in 1999 that I think was contributory towards his exoneration in 2000. Now, to answer your question about, yes, that's true that the Indianapolis had no submarine detection or submarine attack equipment. Destroyers had that, right? Not cruisers. And destroyers had sonars and depth charges, and cruisers didn't. But McVay, in response to you were unescorted to depth concern, you said, no, I ran all over the Pacific unescorted. I was Spruance's flagship. Every time we needed to reposition during any battle, we weren't escorted. So no, it wasn't the first time, and it didn't concern me. But the survivors kept making a big deal of the fact that they weren't escorted, and they ignore McVay's own testimony that it didn't bother him and didn't demand an escort. He asked if one was available. When he was told no, no big deal. I've done this 100 times, right, without an escort, so I'm not concerned by that. As far as the submarine threat goes, the job that McVay had prior to taking command of Indianapolis, he was a head of intelligence for the Combined Chiefs of Staff. Combined Chiefs of Staff was the United States, United Kingdom Joint Chiefs of Staff together. Both the United States and United Kingdom had broken the code to the Japanese naval code. So we were literally reading the Japanese mail. My opinion is McVay knew this when he had that position as head of intelligence for the Combined Chiefs of Staff. So when he went to become captain of the Indianapolis, he no longer had need to know. So he was no longer able to read the Japanese mail like he would have done as head of intelligence for the Combined Chiefs of Staff. But he also knew that we, the Navy, were reading the Japanese mail. And we, the Navy, knew where all the submarines were because we got their orders. We were able to break the code and read their operational orders. And so when the people in Guam told him that there was no submarine threat, he believed that because he knew that we knew where the submarines were. So now it was top secret that we were reading the Japanese message traffic, right? And so he can't say to his crew, well, you don't need to zigzag because we know where the submarines are. And they told me there's none on our route. But so he zigzags anyway until it's too dark. And you say, well, why didn't he just continue to zigzag? Well, you know what? He just run across the Pacific Ocean at flank speed. That puts a lot of wear and tear. Anybody who knows anything about machinery knows, that puts a lot of wear and tear on your machines. You want to give your machines a break and do maintenance on them when you can. And you can't do that if you're running across from Guam to Leyte at flank speed again. So when you zigzag, in order to make a certain speed across that Philippine Sea, you've got to run at 24 knots to make 17 knots speed of advance. If you run straight, you can run at 17 knots. That significantly reduces the wear and tear. And remember, he believed that we were going to be invading Japan. And his ship was going to be the Fifth Fleet flagship for the invasion of Japan. So he needed to train his crew and take care of his equipment and his engines. And so that's why he would have slowed down and stopped zigzagging at night, which is what he did. When the moon was hidden behind clouds, they stopped zigzagging. And unfortunately, the moon peeked out behind the cloud at exactly the wrong moment for the I-58 to see him. And he wasn't zigzagging, and the rest is history. He was convicted for not zigzagging.
Well, and some basic math might even say, too, that I think that they cited in the documentary that flank speed was around 30 nautical miles per hour-ish.
Correct. That's right.
If you're doing that, that's full speed. And this submarine is half a mile away and shooting torpedoes that can go 50 miles an hour. There's literally no way that you can outrun that, even if you had known. That's
true, but the torpedoes have limited fuel, and the range that they can go is not great, right? So, and so they're going to run out of fuel. You can go 30 knots, and the torpedo may go 50 miles an hour, but it's going to run out of fuel after a couple of minutes, right? And so it's the old joke about, I don't have to outrun the bear, I just have to outrun you, right? So you just have to outrun the torpedo. If it had infinite fuel, it would catch you. But again, the point is that the modeling showed that there's no way, even with zigzagging at 24 knots, there was no way that they were not going to get hit by at least one torpedo. And once the ship gets hit by one torpedo, it's going to be slowed down. And then all you have to do is reload, hit it a second time, and you're going to sink it. So it was not going, once the Indianapolis and the I-58 appeared in the same spot of the ocean at the same moment in time, any reasonably competent skipper of a submarine is going to sink that ship. And Muchisaro Hashimoto, the CEO of the I-58, was a reasonably competent skipper.
I have a comment about him here in just a moment and his role in the court martialing and whatnot. One more question about just the story. They waited out in the water for close to 5 days. What was the problem? How did nobody find them? Aren't ships they're supposed to be reported when they come into port and let the harbor know? How was it not known that they were missing?
Well, this is even a more egregious screw up than failure to zigzag, because that ship was routed from Guam to Leyte. There's a dividing line halfway down the Philippine Sea where basically transfer from one maritime command, one naval command to another naval command. But there's a message that hands off the ship from the commander Marianas to the commander Philippines. We'll say it that way, right? Leyte. And so that message went out. And when the ship, so the guys in the Philippines and Leyte knew when the ship was supposed to arrive. They knew that it didn't arrive. And they didn't do anything about it. They just presumed that its orders had been changed and didn't tell anybody. Hey, didn't check. Hey, Indianapolis was supposed to be here. They're not here. Did something change? And so that resulted, because remember I said 879 crew members went into the water, 316 survived. So 879 minus 316, that number of deaths occurred because of the delay in rescue. And that delay in rescue was 100% the fault of those guys in Leyte who didn't do anything when Indianapolis failed to report. And so, so basically nobody got punished. Now, I would say nobody got punished. Some letters of reprimand were put in service records and then removed. So they got kind of slapped on the wrist and then unpunished for the people that died in the water. And McVay got punished McVay ended up being the only one who was court-martialed, and his court-martial stuck. So when the Navy court-martialed McVay, the families of all of those people lost. Now, remember, there was 1,100 crew members on this ship. 316 survived. So all those families, 1,100 minus 316, from their perspective, the Navy has blamed McVay for the death of their loved ones because they court-martialed him. So who are they to, claim otherwise? So if the Navy blamed him, every one of those families of the lost at sea blamed him too. And for years, well, until his death, until his suicide, he would get hate mail from family members of these, crew members who died at sea, 879 crew members who died at sea. And in my opinion, that's what caused him to kind of, the PTS he was experiencing himself from the sinking and the guilt that goes along with the sinking. I was captain. I lost my ship. I lost 879 crew members, was amplified by all these letters from family members until he committed suicide. And so it was a horrible, horrible story from beginning to end. And again, the only one who got punished for anything was McVay. And this is why I felt I had to get involved in helping with the exoneration.
I can't even imagine the mental burden that he must have felt for something like this, not even considering people mailing him and like berating him, probably oftentimes very publicly for something that, as history would show, was not his fault. One thing that I thought was extremely interesting and kind of, in my mind, shined a bad light on the Navy And maybe we can talk about the military judicial system, NJP, court martial process in general. But they actually brought Captain Hashimoto, the captain of the submarine that sunk him, to his court martial after
to
the fact.
testify
This
against
was
them.
to testify against him. That is unbelievable to me. Somebody we would have considered an enemy
Correct.
6 months before to come and convict somebody. That is just so wrong in my mind.
It's never happened
How-
before or since. It's extremely wrong. By the way, Americans realized how wrong it was. Editorials popped up in newspapers all over the country. Can't believe how egregiously stupid this is. What's wrong with you, Navy, that you bring the enemy in to testify against one of our heroes? So editorial writers all over the country were on McVay's side, and it didn't stop the Navy from doing this really, really stupid thing. But the stupidity continued for 50 years on the Navy's part. When the exoneration finally happened, I was working for the vice chief of naval operations, the number 2 admiral in the Navy, right? And he was called to testify in front of the Senate on McVay's exoneration. And I was working for him, and he knew I knew this story intimately. He knew that I had been the captain of the submarine in Indianapolis. He knew that I was involved in getting the exoneration passed and all of that. Or that I had taken the side. The exoneration hadn't happened yet. I had taken the side of exonerating, exonerating McVay. And again, my strong opinion, this is one of the things that really upset me, pissed me off about the Navy, was, we talk about being a learning organization. Okay, let's be a learning organization. Let's go back and let's ask ourselves, has anything in the course of the last 50 years, 1945 to let's say 2000, it would be 55 years, right? Has anything changed in our ability to analyze the situation to cause us to revisit our position, the one we took in 1945? And one of the things that changed was my analysis, right? The proving that it wouldn't have mattered whether it was zigzagging or not. They couldn't have done that in 1945. The Navy could have said, you know what? Toti's right here. We can now analytically derive the fact that zigzagging wouldn't have helped. Therefore, we shouldn't have convicted him. So that was issue number 1. Issue number 2, before you take an action, you've got to ask yourself what the intended desired outcome would be. And in 1945, the Navy never articulated what the desired outcome would be. They didn't say, we're going to court-martial him because we intend to achieve this objective. We're going to teach captains that they've got to blindly follow orders. Of course, that they would never say that because that's not what they want. So what was the objective they were trying to pursue in seeking the court-martial? There wasn't any. Okay. And in 2000, we knew that. Actually, when I crafted my boss's testimony for the Senate hearing, I focused on that point, right? With the benefit of hindsight, it's clear that justice was not served by seeking this court-martial. And there was no benefit, right? So, and I thought that was a pretty reasonable stance we could take in not opposing the exoneration. And in fact, the weekend before the hearing, my boss called me at home to tell me that he wasn't going to be able to present that testimony that I had prepared for him, and that he was going to take a hard line. And the third thing was truth. For 55 years, the Navy had said that McVay wasn't court-martialed for sinking a ship. He was court-martialed for not following tactical guidelines, right? And hazarding the ship by not. Well, it turns out the prosecutor in the McVay's trial, a court-martial, his son was still alive and living in Arlington, Virginia, just outside of DC, Alexandria, Arlington. And it turns out the son still had his dad's notes from the prosecution of McVay. And I was connected with his son, and I asked if I could see his notes. And he said, sure, come on by the house. And you can look at my dad's notes from the court-martial. And plain as day, in his dad's notes was the fact that we're prosecuting McVay for the sinking of a ship. So the Navy had been lying to the public for 55 years. So for all three reasons, reason number one, there was no logical, rational, intended outcome to come from the court-martial. Reason number two, modern analysis was able to prove that court-martial was not, or that zigzagging was not effective. Therefore, he didn't hazard a ship. Reason number three, that stated reason for doing the court-martial in the first place that the Navy presented to the public was a lie. And for all three reasons, the Navy in 2000 should have backed down. And when they didn't, it made me mad. This is my Navy. I've been in the Navy for 24 years at that point. No, less than that, actually. Right? I'd been in the Navy for 20 years at that point, and I loved the Navy. And the fact that they were still doing this made me mad. And so what I ended up doing was kind of slipping notes to the Senate staff secretly, working against my own boss, sadly, right? And it was probably career limiting, but it was the right thing to do. And then, of course, now I don't want to take credit for the exoneration because there were a lot of people involved in it. I mean, the guy that brought it to the public's attention in the first place was a 13-year-old boy by the name of Hunter Scott. That's what got the hearings set up to begin with, right? This is all this public focus that Hunter Scott had been bringing to the fact that there was this 13-year-old boy aggressively waging this fight to exonerate a World War II captain. That was a big story. And that put it in the public's, mind. It brought it to attention, including to Congress, right? Wouldn't have been in front of Congress had Hunter Scott not done what he did. But the problem was the survivors and Hunter were all using these same kind of worn out arguments that have been used for 55 years that hadn't moved the Navy, that were actually technically ineffective because any captain can be held responsible for any failure on any given day. And the only way to get that overturned is to prove that it actually wasn't a failure. So it was the only thing that really could move the needle was this torpedo analysis that I had done. So they brought it to the attention of the public and to the Congress. And the analysis I had done proved beyond a reasonable doubt that he wasn't guilty. And so it's a combination of those factors that resulted in the exoneration. I think remove any one of those elements and it wouldn't have happened, but I'm glad that it did.
Well, and I don't want to speak for the survivors, but as somebody who is an admirer and hopeful learner of history, I think that a lot of people owe you a great deal for your contribution to the exoneration. My question to that is going to be, despite the Navy not having the knowledge, the technical expertise that you brought here, when this went to trial again, why did they fight this so hard?
It was the lawyers. And I was in the middle of this. I was arguing with Navy lawyers who were arguing that the Navy could be held accountable, that people would, there's a liability issue. That if the Navy changed its position in 90s or whatever, that somebody could sue, right? Some family member could sue. And it was stupid. And history has proven nobody was interested in litigation. Nobody. And I was telling the Navy that in 99, 2000, I know these guys. Nobody's talking about suing. Right? So they just want to be told that it wasn't their fault that their ship was sunk, right? Once and for all. They want the Navy to admit that. And the Navy kept saying, well, he was never convicted for having his ship sunk. And then, of course, that was a lie. Prosecutor's notes proved that that's exactly what the Navy intended to do. So, and they knew that. So, it's just a sad story. And I give this talk occasionally that's titled, you have to do the right thing for your people. And if you don't, it's going to haunt you for 50 plus years. The Navy did not do the right thing for the crew of the Indianapolis and Captain McVay. And it haunted them for 55 years until Congress got involved in correcting it. So do the right thing and save yourself those 55 years of torment. And so I think that's a really important lesson, not for just government agencies, but for companies as well.
That is an important lesson. And I think that there are a lot of interesting parallels to current happenings and issues our modern Navy is facing today might be a conversation for another episode.
Absolutely.
But
Yeah.
the fight for image of what's being portrayed and what they are and aren't responsible for, that line is moving, I think. One of my last questions on this is, what did you learn about the judicial process that needs to change? What about court martialing? What about this did you learn that needs the light shined on it so things like this don't happen?
Well, the way court martials are conducted today has changed compared to 1945. Now, remember that McVay's attorney was a degreed attorney, but not a practicing attorney. Okay. So he had a defense counsel that had never done court martial as a defense counsel before. That would not happen today. And, you can go down the list. The most fundamental thing, and I actually talk about this in my book, is that the government is not immune from lying. Okay. It's sad to say that. You would think that, well, the government has no personal stake in the outcome. Therefore, their presumption is that they would tell the truth. Well, it turns out not to be the case, right? Human beings are human beings, whether they're in industry or government, private world or whatever. And human beings sometimes shade the truth to protect themselves. And so I think that's one of those things that presumption is, if somebody goes to court martial, that there's a good case against them, and that the government is doing this for altruistic reasons. And that may not be true. And that's the thing that I really learned from the 1945 case that I believe is still true today.
That highlights such a difficult problem where we need to believe in our government. Like we really, really do. Because if we don't, there's going to be absolute chaos,
Right.
reigning throughout the country. But I think that figuring out where that line is of believing but not unquestioning, maybe is the way to put that, is and them being able to be called on it. One of the things you were talking about with me before we started recording, one of the things that has frustrated you going through this process of the Indy, is that the crew members gave media control of the narrative. Will you talk a little bit about that, and maybe talk about if the same thing would happen today?
Yeah, the same thing probably would happen today on steroids. To answer that question first, the media is much more aggressive at spin today than it was, throughout this long ordeal for the survivors to try to exonerate and tell the story. And the thing that I worry about is that you talk to somebody about World War II cruiser USS Indianapolis, the first thing that comes to mind is sharks, right? That's the way the public perceives the story. And frankly, that started with the movie Jaws that I talked about, right? Because to the character named Quint in the movie Jaws, it was a shark story because Steven Spielberg leveraged that in the movie Jaws. And ever since then, if the story of Indianapolis has been told, it's going to be a shark story. You're going to see them on Shark Week on the Discovery Channel or something like that, right? And that's so sad, in my opinion, because this is a ship that went through 10 major battles during World War II, right? A lot of heroism on that ship. Struck by a kamikaze, fought back, kept the ship afloat, delivered the atomic bomb. There's so much heroism that ship represents. And to reduce it to a story about men trying to fight off sharks in the water does the ship and its history and its crew a great disservice, because the Indianapolis story is not a story about sharks. The shark aspect is the tabloid aspect. It's the National Enquirer version of the USS Indianapolis story. It's not the true, visceral element of the story. The visceral element of the story is one of perseverance, survival, and not giving up, right? aggressive heroism. And so it's a whole bunch of things. And it's a classic story. In fact, people say, well, that ought to be a movie about the Indianapolis. And okay, what movie do you want to make? Do you want to make a movie about this great fighting ship that was Spoons' flagship and got through all these battles? That's a story, right? That's a movie. Or do you want to make a movie about the ship that survived a kamikaze attack, recovered, delivered an atomic bomb? That's a movie. Or do you want to make a movie about a submarine a captain that had never sunk a ship during the entire war and happens to be in the right place at the right time to sink Indianapolis? That's a movie. Or do you want to make a movie about the heroism and survival of 5 days in the water and the miraculous rescue? Or do you want to make a courtroom drama, right? Every one of these. Or do you want to make 55 years of struggling to clear their captain's name? Every one of those is a 2-hour movie. You can't make a movie about this. You can make a miniseries, 10-episode miniseries, but there's too much. And if you ever told somebody this story who didn't know the history, it's almost, if you wrote a story about this, people wouldn't believe it. It's too much for one storyline. It's almost like you can't make this stuff up. That's how incredible this story is. And so, yeah, it's kind of heartbreaking in many ways that the thing that brought the USS Indianapolis, most of the survivors didn't talk about the Indianapolis until the movie Jaws came out. They went from 1945 to 1975 when the movie Jaws came out, never discussing the fact that they were on the ship. And then suddenly people started saying, hey, is this story about the Indianapolis? You were in World War II. Did you ever hear anything about the Indianapolis? Not only did I hear about it, I was on it when it sunk. Yeah, it's a true story. That's how they started talking about it. And so from day one, the shark narrative has controlled the story. And it's a shame because there's so much good about that ship that you should not allow the terror aspect of it to control the narrative.
How do we as individuals get control of the narrative back?
By refusing to talk about sharks, right? By talking about everything else that ship went through. And, using the court-martial and exoneration as a case study in doing the right thing and failure to do the right thing, and how, fate corrected it. I would say fate, how karma corrected this failure to do the right thing. Use whatever, God corrected it. Use whatever motive force you want to use. But there's so many lessons in this story that there's no lessons in the sharks. There's only terror, right? And so the only lesson there is that if you don't assertively grab hold of the story and control the narrative, the tabloid aspect of media will take control from you. That's the only lesson. It's not a good one.
It certainly isn't. As we're talking about controlling the narrative, you recently released a book called CO to CEO, and in the heart of talking to veterans in transition. Mm-hmm. How do we as veterans help control our narrative?
Yes, that's an important point, right? Because oftentimes what I found is, in my 15 years in industry leading to my, role as CEO of Spartan Corporation, that the veterans are instructed badly by the military services in how to transition to industry and what aspects of their military career they should focus on. And, a lot of times, and I hired hundreds, if not thousands of veterans in the 15 years I served in industry. And a lot of times what I found was that the guidance that they were given was completely wrong in their transition course. And there are different names for the courses now, but then when I went through, it was called Transition Assistance Program or TAP course. Skills Bridge, I think it's called now. But this one factor remains the same, is most of the time the people teaching the course have not succeeded in industry themselves. They're trainers, instructors, not people who've been there and done it. And I still don't know who writes their lesson plan for them. I've been trying to find that out from the government, from the military, and I've not succeeded. It's interesting that when you write a book telling people that what you've learned in your transition courses may not exactly be the correct way to transition, I should not be surprised by the fact that the people that are responsible for the courses that I'm criticizing kind of shut down on you and don't want to talk to you, right? Don't want to contribute to any of my arguments that veterans are not being well served. But the truth is, veterans are not being well served. There are aspects of your military career that are going to be invaluable to your future employer. And oftentimes the employer doesn't even understand what aspects they should look for, and how to, and I'm going to use the word retrain the veteran to succeed in industry as a civilian. But I believe, having been in industry for 15 years, working around other companies, not just mine, but working for 5 or 6 different companies in my time, that nearly every company wants to hire veterans for the right reasons. They want to hire veterans because they know it's the right thing to do, and the company both wants to give back, but also believes that doing well will allow them to do good. Doing good will allow them to do well, and that they're going to get a lot out of veteran employees that they would not get out of non-veteran employees. But in order to benefit from that, companies need to understand what the veterans are going to be good at and what they may need a little reorientation or redirection on. And the book tries to do both things. It tries to tell veterans, these are the things you need to do to succeed in industry in your civilian job. But it also tries to teach companies how to help their veterans succeed in industry. And so the book's title is From CO to CEO, but the subtitle is A Practical Guide for Transitioning from Military to Industry Leadership. And that's the underscored part, right? A practical guide for transitioning from military to industry leadership. There are I would say there are several books on the market that purport to give veterans advice on how to succeed in industry, but they're really just hand-waving pablum nonsense, right? Things you can get from any leadership book that's put in veteran language. What I try to do is give almost step-by-step instructions for the veteran and for the company that's hiring the veteran on how to make that veteran successful.
You kind of started to touch on it there. One of the first questions that anytime that there's a book, it's like, who is this for?
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like this is for people that maybe are in hiring positions at industry type companies and also the veteran themselves. Is that right?
Yeah. Now I write the book with the audience being in the voice of somebody talking to the veterans, right? So when you read this as a veteran who's beginning the transition process, and I talk about the fact that you need to start taking action 18 months before you get out of the military, you're reading, it's talking to you, the transitioning veteran. The companies, obviously the company's a bigger audience. There's 200,000 veterans a year leaving the military, believe it or not. But there's more, companies that hire veterans than 200,000. And the companies that are reading it will read and they'll say, well, he's talking to veterans here. No, but I'm talking to veterans in a way that the companies will understand, right? What they need to do to help the veteran succeed. I've seen too many companies hire a veteran, basically throw them into the deep end of the pool, and the veteran struggles. And then the company says, well, you know what? This isn't working out. Looks like I'm going to have to let this guy go. And my point is that it's as much a responsibility of the company to make this relationship successful as it is the veteran. And there's no excuse for the company not knowing what the veteran's going to be good at and what they're going to need to be trained on. There's no excuse because it's knowable. And if you're going to invest in hiring somebody, you would think that you would take the time to figure out what you need to do to make that person successful. But way too many companies don't do that. And so the book is intended for both audiences.
Well, and veterans, current former military members, bring so much to the table in a corporate environment. It's not that's one of the things that kind of irks me when talking about like hiring and whatnot is being a veteran gets you the extra couple points on your application, and I advocate to people to
Maybe,
use that to
maybe
your
only for
advantage.
government jobs, by the way. No, maybe not for industry jobs, but go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't know that, but people should be hiring veterans because they have a unique skill set, not to fill a, hey, we give back or whatever. What do you think about that? Do you think that a lot of people hide under that? Oh, look at how many veterans we're hiring. Do they actually care about that? Or is
Yeah,
it something to
I
give
think
the
they
appearance?
too many companies look at it in the light of, oh, look at how good we're doing giving a veteran a job. But nobody tracks, well, did that veteran actually succeed and stay with you? Right. So they track the inflow, but not the outflow. And if the veteran does leave, and there are reasons accompanying that in some ways, veterans can be a risk for the company. Okay. And companies don't think that through before they hire them. They want to be given credit for the hiring act, but not the success act. They don't track the success aspect. And when the veteran fails or is let go or whatever, or leaves voluntarily because they're not, the coupling isn't made, right? They're not transitioning well. Nobody says, well, why are we losing veterans as our employees here? What is there something we should have done that we didn't do? And that question is almost always yes. But they didn't know that there was something that they should have done that they didn't do. This expression that I use is from an electrical engineering concept called impedance mismatch. It's like, and I use the example, you plug your 120 volt appliance into the United Kingdom's 240 volt outlet, right? There's going to be a problem. And too many times when a veteran joins a company, it's exactly like that, right? It's like plugging a 120 volt appliance into a 240 volt outlet. And nobody took the time to think, wait a minute, there's going to be an adjustment here. What do we need to do to make this adjustment go well? The company acts as if it's the veteran's responsibility to make that adjustment go well. And the veteran is misled by the poor training they received in the skills bridge, whatever, in their transition training courses. And so they think it's going to go like one way. The company thinks it's going to go like another way. And nobody ever closes that gap. And then it results in, a very stressful situation with the veteran transitioning out of the military and industry into an unknown environment that's going to be very stressful, whether or not it's successful. If it's then not successful, and the veteran now needs to worry about income and mortgage and kids school or whatever, right? It makes it worse, and the company is culpable in those failures if they didn't plan the transition correctly. And so it can't just throw it on the veteran and say it was their responsibility. The company is culpable as well, because they could have known what it was going to take to make the veteran successful, and they didn't take the time and opportunity to learn.
That's an interesting take. I don't hear a lot of people pointing to the companies as needing to take more responsibility for the veterans integration into the business. I'm assuming in your example, the impedance mismatch example, that the veteran is the 240 volt
Sometimes,
versus
yeah.
the
Yeah. Well, I mean,
you
that's a great point because, for example, veterans are correct in patting themselves on the back for the fact that they are put in leadership positions very early in their career, right? I'll take the case of it, first class leading petty officer or a junior officer. They're in their 20s and they're put in a very robust leadership position. But the skills that they used, the leadership techniques they used that might have been necessary on active duty are likely not going to be necessary in industry, right? Or they're going to have to leverage different leadership skills when they're in industry. And so, that's the 240 volt bit, right? So they can get in a lot of trouble in their industry jobs using the skills that made them successful in the military if they don't understand the need to modulate their methods. And that's one of the messages I try to convey in the book.
I'm getting a lot of other mental images of kind of like almost a bull in a china shop, so to speak, where you've got somebody that's to survive in the military, there's a certain amount of energy that you got to have to be, hanging with the best of them. And I think that comes across as, or I can imagine comes across as disruptive and a little bit aggressive in maybe a traditional workplace environment.
Exactly right. And I give an example in the book where very early in my industry career, when I was in a director position, I was assigned to let a retired one-star general go. And, the talking points I was given when it was time to terminate this guy was, HR told me that the problem is he didn't adapt well, that he was a command and control leader. And that confused me because I said, command and control is a good thing. In the military, you command forces and you control their movement and things like that. How is he's going to be as confused as I am because we think of command and control as a good thing. What do you mean? And she said he commands his employees, like barks out orders and expects immediate compliance. And so, in other words, she was using the expression command and control to portray something different than we think of it in the military. And it was a very bad thing. It was very directive leadership style that doesn't work with civilians. And I joke with my active duty friends, leadership is hard, but it's even harder when you're leading people who can actually quit. And so, that's the example I give in the book of a thing that you may have to change. And I've seen it happen dozens of times, maybe hundreds of times, where leaders, people come in to industry thinking they succeeded in the military as leaders, ergo, automatically they're going to succeed as a leader in industry, and they fall flat on their face because they don't understand a different environment.
One of the things you highlighted there, I think is so important, is just making sure that you guys are defining your terms the same way. The command and control is being used in two very different contexts there. You mentioned something at the beginning where you talk about what's actually needed and being told to, or what is actually being needed by the veteran in an industry role and what is being taught they're not aligning, they're not matching. Where is that miscommunication happening, and on what specific topics are people being led astray on that you look to dive into in the book?
I think in their zeal to make the veteran feel good about their potential for success in industry, the courses focus on things that they should feel good about and don't convey enough of, holy cow, there's going to be a lot of work to do here to succeed in this new environment. And the example I give, I was told when I was transitioning that all your future employer wants from you is good leadership. And I wanted to believe that that was true, right? Because I believed that I was a good leader. And so if all they wanted from me is good leadership, boom, instant success, right? But that's not even true in the military. If it was true in the military, you could take a bomber or wing commander from the Air Force and put him in command of a submarine, and they would do just fine. And it's ludicrous to even talk like that, right? To even raise the concept, because we know instinctively that you actually need to know something about submarine before you're going to succeed in command of that submarine or you're in any capacity on that submarine, not even command, even the lowest level. And so even in the military, good leadership is not a sufficient attribute to allow you to succeed. So why do you think it would be sufficient in industry? when it's not. So basically, we were beguiled into believing our probability of success was higher than it really was. And so what I tell people is when you transition, you need to think of it as you're starting over again, because you are, right? In that new job, you don't know anything about what it's going to take to succeed. And it doesn't matter if you're an electrician on a ship and now you're going to be an electrician in a company. The attributes that it's going to take to succeed are much more financially driven in that company than they were on the ship. And so you could be the best technical electrician in the world, but if you spend 5 times the budget that was bid on the job in getting the work done, you're going to fail. And so there's a lot more that needs to be done to prepare for the industry job than I think the folks teaching the courses want to let the veterans believe.
That money comment is a very funny one. I think that as a junior enlisted person who spent a lot of time working on expensive electronics, there is literally no concept of what it takes to repair a job and no higher level thinking that's implemented, at least at our level, about, hey, is this the right thing in terms of, are we on budget for this piece of equipment and
Right.
so forth. There's not that level of thought, or it's not even needed, but we're certainly not thinking about it. I think that you really are hitting the nail on the head with something, and I'm kind of having some flashbacks here to my transition course, and it probably a lot of the same narratives were echoed, but they really try to talk about how the military is a stepping stone. Like it's the stepping stone to this next thing, and people are going to be beating down the door to like have you come and work for them. And the reality is that's just not true. Like it's, you are maybe slightly more competitive because of the things that we've talked about, where, hey, corporations that see and like to hire military people, but outside of that, like you really need to understand why your skills are better suited than the next person. You're still having to compete.
Right. The being a veteran provides significant advantages in certain areas. Number one, you lived through the suck. And so, you know how to drive through the suck. And so you can, if you figure out a way to get yourself motivated about the mission in your new job, you're going to have the fire in the belly that the company's looking for, because you've had to have that in order to get through your military experience. So that's advantage one. And not everybody, trust me, I've hired a lot of people who are not veterans with no fire in the belly. That was like, they're here for the paycheck and we couldn't care less about the mission that we're doing, right, as a company. I've also hired veterans who think that the mission ended when they left active duty. That, this isn't defense of the country. This is about, I'm making money for my boss. And then they lose the fire in the belly. And that doesn't work out for them either, right? You need to understand the mission, the larger perspective, and keep that fire in the belly. The second thing the veteran has is they've been put in positions where they have to learn their jobs on active duty quickly. And in civilian life, you're going to have to do the same thing. You're going to have to learn quickly. And the guy coming out of college or the gal coming out of college, they've had no experience in the real world, right? You have no idea how long it's going to take for them to get up to speed. Even if they have a degree in mechanical engineering and their new job is as a mechanical engineer, you have no idea how long it's going to take them to get up to speed in a production capacity. You do have an idea that veteran has been in a production type environment, whether it's combat or otherwise, right? It was a shipyard or, aviation maintenance or whatever. They've been in a production environment. You do know that they know how to get up to speed in that environment. So that's advantage number 2. And, I would say advantage number 3 is they know things. They've had life experience, and, that a lot of their competitors who are not veterans don't have. And that life experience brings a level of maturity and gravitas that a lot of the non-veterans just won't have. And companies do look for that. So there are a lot of advantages of being a veteran, as long as the company understands that there may be some challenges that the company can help the veteran overcome and help them adjust to. And, you know, there are going to be some things that aspects that they may think that they know, but they don't really. So, for example, I had this subspecialty in the Navy called financial management because I worked in the Pentagon and I worked on the Navy's budget. And I was beguiled into believing that that allowed me to know something about financial management. When I got into industry, I quickly realized I knew nothing about financial management as required to succeed in my industry job. So, that was an important lesson for me. Thank God I learned that lesson quickly and was able to get trained on industry focused financial management. But I was led to believe by the military and beguile myself into believing that I had more knowledge than I actually did as it pertained to industry. And that was a hurdle that I really needed to overcome to be successful.
You talked about people having the fire in their belly. I really, really like that term, and it really gets right at everybody knows what you're saying when you describe that. I'm not sure if you talk about this in the book at all. I have yet to read it, but it's now on my list, and it's coming here very shortly. How do you coach people to find the jobs that give us the fire in the belly? Because there's going to be opportunities for veterans to go and work at places that don't give us that.
Mhm.
And there may not ever be a replacement that gives us the fire that we had while serving.
Mhm.
What would you recommend for people that are looking for that?
It's critical that veterans take the long view as they transition industry. So when I say the long view, don't think about what you're doing in the job you take when you leave, when you get out. Think about what you're going to be doing 10 to 15 years down the road and keep fully focused on that. When you get out of the military, if you start immediately looking at the job as a paycheck, you're never going to progress beyond that job, whatever it is, because people don't want folks working for them who are only thinking about the paycheck, right? If you think 10 to 15 years down the road, where do I want to be then? Then it helps you keep the right attitude in the job that you're in now. And so that's really the most important bit of advice that I could give. Let's say you're not excited about the job you have now, but it's a stepping stone to get where you want to be. That should make you excited, right? And that should help you find that fire in the belly. Like I had this conversation with my kids today, right? They're in their 30s, my kids. so I'm not loving my job. Okay, great. Then think about the job you want and how success in this job is going to get you there, and get excited about that. And that's something I think veterans lose sight of. No, you're not going to be defending the nation. You might be doing a permutation of that if you work at a defense company, but let's say you're not. Getting a job at Home Depot or whatever. You get it. I got it. If that's the only thing you think you're ever going to do, okay, then it's a paycheck. But if it's a stepping stone to where you want to be, you better find that fire.
I don't think that the military teaches that type of thinking. And I think that that's maybe why that is such a struggle to think long term. You're thinking, I'm at this unit or command for 3 years or however long it is. If I can just make it through that and, focus on this advancement exam or whatever that looks like,
Mhm.
that type of long-term thinking and planning is certainly not something that's discussed as much as it should be. I want to ask why you wrote this book. I think that just from everything that we've talked about today, and there's probably at least 2 or 3 other episodes worth of podcasts about other things that have happened in your life and career, you've made it by a lot of different standards. And I know that people don't usually set out to write a book as a financial endeavor. we've had a couple people on past episodes talking about the economics of book writing, and it doesn't
Yeah,
seem to be super lucrative.
you're going to lose money. There's no doubt.
Why write this book?
Yeah, why spend a year writing it, a year getting it in bookstores, and a whole bunch of money when I'm never going to break even, right?
That sounds great.
Yeah, whoa, sign me up for that. It's because I got tired of telling people the same thing over and over and over again. I had thousands of veteran employees over the course of my 15 years in industry, thousands, okay? And, not all of them interfaced with me directly. Most of them, I would say, were several layers down in the organization. But even the ones I hired directly that were direct reports, I kept having the same conversation over and over, and it was Groundhog Day, okay? And because I would say, no, I love the fact that you're a veteran. I went for a veteran explicitly for this position, and you should be proud of your service just like I'm proud of mine. But there are some, hazards here. There's some tripwires you need to be aware of. And then I would outline them for them. And, it gets really fatiguing to have that conversation for every veteran employee that you're bringing into the company. And again, I hired directly hundreds. I had thousands of employees in the company working for me in various companies, I should say. And there were some people I could have the conversation with, but there was too many for me to have the conversation with every one of them down 4 or 5 layers in the organization. So I looked for a book that made all the points that I wanted to make, because there are several books out there, in the marketplace about here's how the special forces transition. There's lessons for transitioning from the special forces community. Every SEAL that's ever been accepted into the SEAL community has a podcast and has written a book. And, I look for, there's admirals who have written books, who got their position only based on the fact that they're an admiral, and they get somehow relevant to the 24-year-old who's transitioning out of the military. It is absolutely irrelevant. There's almost nothing that admiral is going to be able to tell that 24-year-old, because the admiral didn't go through what the 24-year-old is going to have to go through, right? And so, I look for there are books written by headhunters who've never been in the military, the recruiters who look at the world through the lens of a recruiter, and somebody's trying to place a person in a particular job, who then has probably failed to follow up to find out, was that person actually successful? How long did they last with that company, right? There's all kinds of books out there, none of them from the perspective of somebody who spent a career in uniform, followed by a career as a hiring official in industry, right? And so I looked for a book to save me the trouble of writing one. There wasn't one. So I spent nearly 2 years to get it in bookstores, and I can't tell you how much money. I don't want to. It's embarrassing how much money it costs. And I had a publisher distributor, but even from the marketing standpoint alone, it's an expensive proposition to get books, to get the world to know that this book is out there. Because today, publishing houses say, look, you got to have skin in the game, or we're not going to go down this journey with you. If you're not coughing up the box because you must not believe in your product. Therefore, why should we believe in it and invest all this money? So, it's kind of a hybrid model that most people use nowadays, where the publisher kicks in some, the distributor kicks in some, and the author kicks in some. And by some, I mean a lot. And so you don't do this because you're going to make money. I didn't, I did this because it was the right thing to do. I was just tired of saying the same thing over and over again. And hopefully by getting the book out there, people can benefit from it, which is really what I want.
I think that that's the right mission to go about it. And if nothing else, like you said, maybe it saves you a couple conversations where if people go to ask, you can just say,
read the book.
Here's the book. Call me if you've got any questions.
Exactly. Yeah. And now the book has been out a month, right? A month and a half. Are there things that as I'm having conversations about the book, I wish I put in, sure. Is it 100%? No. But I would say the best book on the market today is 40%. And this one, if I could be so bold as to pat myself in the back, if you about succeeding in industry, right, is 85% better than 40%, right? And so it's not 100%, but and I've read everyone that I know about, I'll tell you, it's the best one out there from the standpoint of somebody who's been in both seats, the active duty seat, and I know what you know kind of thing, right? And the industry seat. I know what you need to know. And I think that that's the only book in the market that does both.
Well, I look greatly looking forward to reading through the rest of it. I think that if the book is even half as good as the conversation that you've given me today and input on from a veteran perspective, I think it'll be an absolute knockout. So I'm looking forward to reading it, and I probably will be following up with you on some questions
Sure.
after that happens. Bill, this has been an absolutely fantastic conversation. I am so grateful for you reaching out. I want to take a second to have you plug anything that you'd like. Where can people go to find the book? Reach out to you if you want that. Learn more about you. Any USS Indianapolis records or documentaries people should be watching. Anything you want to put out.
Yeah. The first thing, my website is William Toti, spelled Toti, Tango, Oscar, Tango, India, right? .com. And so you can go to my website for, links to the book and all of that. And the book is out on, it's ebook, it's hardback, ebook, and audiobook. So whatever format works for you, it's there. On the World War II stuff, the Indianapolis and others, there's a 8-part documentary that's going to be released on Fox Nation, streaming starting May 29th this month. And I'm in all 8 episodes. So you can get your full fill of William Toti by watching this. But we're doing an episode on 8 different ships. Actually, it's more than 8 because we have one episode that covers the 4 cruisers that were sunk during the Battle of Savo Island, Iron Bottom Sound. But we cover the Indianapolis as episode 1. The Johnston, these are all World War II ships, even one Japanese ship, the Musashi, we cover in an episode. And so I really recommend folks, it'll be streaming on demand after May 29th, so you can watch it on Fox Nation. Veterans get a free year subscription to Fox Nation. So no excuse. You don't have to pay to see it. No excuse for not watching it. If you're in any way interested in World War II history, you will love this 8-episode documentary because we reveal video footage of the found wrecks at the bottom of the ocean, bottom of the Pacific, as well as analyzing the battles and how they sunk. So I hope people find it interesting. But I really appreciate your time and attention on the books. I hope that veterans do find value in this book. It's struggled to get the word out, so I appreciate you doing this with me, Brock.
Absolutely. Honestly, thank you for coming on. Thank you on behalf of other Navy veterans and what you're doing to help encourage people and push them in the right space. And dare I venture to say thank you on behalf of the Indy crew. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for tuning in today. Your listenership helps me better educate people like you and the rest of our nation's military, both past and present, on building a successful life outside of military service. If you're looking for more ways the top vets are leading more effective lifestyles, building businesses, and using the resources designed specifically for you, press here for a selection of some of the best clips. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel to stay up to date, and I will be talking with you soon.